As you continue to improve your game, you will have more tactical and positional ideas competing for your attention. How do you choose a move? Should you try to play a tactic, or do you need to improve your position first? Did your opponent's last move create a strong threat in the position, or should you ignore it and create an attack yourself? There are no easy answers to these questions, but the more you practice answering these questions, the better your move choices will be. Let's take a look at some positions and try to decide how to choose the best move. In this position, white has a serious advantage. White's pieces are far more active than black's, and notice that white has doubled rooks, putting pressure on f7. Black's king looks a lot weaker than white's king, and it looks like white has a crushing tactic. White plays rook takes f7 check, forcing king to h8. When you play a game of chess, it is important to think about what has changed in the position after every move. After calculating that white can win a knight by force, after king h8, white did not ask what's changed in the position after the last move, and quickly grabs black's knight with rook takes d7. By only focusing on what white could do and ignoring the opponent's ideas, what did white overlook? When black's king left the g-file, black's rook on g8 is now pointing at the g2 square, joining the queen hiding on a8. Black delivers checkmate with queen takes g2. Let's see what white should have done instead. After king h8, once white notices what has changed, what should white do? Should white immediately block the queen's threat with knight to f3? This move is good, but can you see a way for white to defend against checkmate and threaten to checkmate black? That's right, queen to h3. White protects g2 and also threatens checkmate on the next turn. By combining defense and attack, recognizing the opponent's ideas without giving up on your own ideas, white has a very strong attack against black's weakened kingside and should go on to win this game with careful play. For example, if black plays knight to f8, protecting the h7 square from checkmate, one strong idea for white is to play rook e7, threatening to remove the guard with rook takes f8 on the next turn and deliver checkmate. Black's passive pieces, all on the back rank, are no match for white's active pieces working together. Most players prefer to attack and make threats rather than defend. When we are considering what move to make next, it's useful to ask, what move would my opponent play on the next move? White did not ask this question and only thought about white's possible moves and played queen to f3, attacking the rook on a8 and clearing the way for g4, trying to open up lines against black's king. It's tempting for black to decide where to move the unprotected rook on a8, but why does black need to react? Does black have a stronger threat? Do you notice all the weak dark squares around white's king? Black can play the powerful queen to c3, threatening checkmate, a much stronger threat than white capturing black's rook. Notice that there is no defense to queen b2 checkmate. How could white have avoided this unfortunate end? Let's take a look at the position again. If white would have asked what moves black could play on the next turn, white would soon realize that queen to c3 is a crushing threat. And since white does not have a stronger threat to make against black, white must prevent this threat. Can you see how white can defend the weak c3 square and attack black's powerful dark squared bishop? That's right, knight to e2. And after moving the bishop to safety with bishop to g7, now white can safely play queen to f3. And after rook to c8, threatening queen c2 checkmate, white should be okay after rook to d2. Sometimes you have to find patient, defensive moves before you can start building your position to attack. Let's take a look at one more position. Not all positions have simple attacking or defensive moves that you can find. In this endgame, the material is even, but the one weakness black has is doubled pawns on the c-file. Notice if white only thinks about attacking the weak pawn on c6 with knight to e5. White forces black to make a good move with c5. Black's main weakness in the position, the doubled pawns, will be fixed on the next turn with c takes d4, when black will have a very solid position. What should white do instead? As the c6 pawn is a weakness, this is a clear target to attack. White should first prevent black from removing that weakness, but how can white do this? By freezing the pawn on c6 with c5. Now that white has a concrete target to attack, c6, black is in trouble. After knight to d7, trying to prevent knight to e5, white can still attack c6 with knight to b4. And after knight to b8, white overwhelms black's defenses with knight e5. White will win the c6 pawn on the next turn and have good chances to win this endgame. Now that you've looked at ways to choose a move, it's time to prove that you can find the best moves. How often do you find yourself in the middle of a chess game, and when it's your turn to move, you have no idea what to play? It happens to all of us. When there isn't a clear tactic or obvious move to play, we need to find a plan. Sometimes plans can be complicated, long-term ideas, but more often they can be a simpler 2 to 3 move idea. In this position, with black to move, it isn't easy to find a move to play. Let's find a plan for black. Where do you notice the most tension in the position between the white and black pieces? Black has 2 pieces attacking the central pawn on d4, and white has 2 defenders. White's knight on f3 is an important piece. It protects the d4 pawn and also joins that pawn in putting pressure on the e5 square. Notice the knight on f3 isn't protected, and black's rook on f8 is x-raying the knight through the bishop on f6. Is there a discovered attack with the bishop? The bishop doesn't have a lot of moves available. There doesn't seem to be a good tactic. When you don't know what to do, one plan is to find your worst placed piece and try to improve it. One idea would be to play rook c8, moving the rook to a file that is not blocked by pawns, so it may open up soon. Notice the bishop on d7 is passive. It is guarding the weak e6 pawn, but other than that, it isn't very effective. Can you find a 2-move plan that improves the bishop and attacks the knight on f3? By asking that question, you may have found the strange-looking but powerful move, bishop e8. Black's plan is now clear. The bishop is going to move to h5 on the next move, improving one of black's less effective pieces and attacking one of white's most important pieces in the battle for the center, the knight on f3. After rook f to e1 and bishop h5, black attacks the knight, pinning it to the rook on d1. Black is now threatening to capture the knight and win the pawn on d4 by removing one of its key defenders. White responded to this threat by playing bishop e2, protecting the knight and clearing the d-file for white's queen and rook to help protect the d4 pawn. Now that the light-squared bishop has been improved, what should black do next? How can we continue with our plan to add more pressure to the d4 square? Can you improve a piece that isn't doing that much and add more pressure to the d4 target? If you felt the knight on e7 isn't very effective right now, great job! Black brings the knight into action and supports the plan to attack d4 with knight f5. Move by move, black is focused on improving pieces that weren't very effective and now has a comfortable position with all of the minor pieces working together to put pressure on the key d4 square. Black was able to convert this comfortable position into victory. Let's take a look at another example. In this position, both sides once again are fighting for control of the d4 square. White played the strange-looking move bishop d3, attacking black's bishop and also blocking the queen's protection of the d4 pawn. Before thinking about a plan, we have to check for tactics. Why can't black just win a pawn with knight takes d4? If we can't answer that question, we should accept our opponent's gift. Can you see white's trick? After knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, white has lured the queen to the d4 square, and now that it is unprotected, white wins the queen by using the discovered attack, bishop b5 check, checking black's king and revealing white's queen's attack on the black queen. Now that we understand that capturing the d4 pawn is a disaster for black, we need to come up with a plan. White's king is already committed to the king side, and black's king still has a choice. One plan is to play safely and capture white's bishop, and then castle kingside. This would be a solid choice, but can we find a more active plan? All of black's minor pieces are developed, and black has developed the queen to an active square on d6. Can you think of a more aggressive way to bring black's king to safety and plan to attack white's kingside? That's right, black can castle queenside. Now that black has castled queenside, knight takes d4 is a threat because white's bishop can no longer check the black king. Did black's decision to castle queenside create a clear plan? When you castle on opposite sides of the board, both sides should try to attack as forcefully as possible against the enemy king. Notice black allows white to trade bishops and double black's pawns on the f-file because black welcomes another pawn into the attack to help open up lines against white's king. After knight e2, protecting the d4 pawn, how can black begin to set up threats against white's kingside and start an attack? If you found g5, great job. The h3 pawn is a hook in white's position that black will try to rip open to start an attack. White's pieces are not as actively developed and are not yet prepared to attack on the queen side. White should have played bishop takes f5 with the idea of moving the queen to d3, attacking the f5 pawn, trying to catch up on development, and slow down black's attack. But in the game, white played c3, adding more protection to the d4 pawn and preparing b4 to start a queenside attack. But black's attack crashes through first with g4, attacking the knight on f3 and the pawn on h3, so black will be able to open lines on the next move. By castling queenside, black forced both sides to focus on the plan of attacking on opposite wings. Since black's pieces were better developed and prepared for this plan, black was able to gain an advantage and later won the game. Let's take a look at one more example together. In this position, material is equal, and at first glance the position may look balanced. With white to move, white can force a trade of queens with queen d5 and enter a bishop and pawn ending. Notice black has 3 pawns that cannot move: a5, c5, and e5. All of these pawns are on dark squares, which restricts the activity of black's dark-squared bishop, and these pawns are also fixed targets for white's dark-squared bishop. White is blocking these pawns with pawns on a4, c4, and e4. Notice they are all on light squares, so black's bishop can never attack them. White's plan is simple: trade queens and use the king and bishop to attack black's weaknesses on the dark squares. After queen d5 check, queen takes d5. How should white recapture? If c takes d5, this allows black's pawn to advance with c4, opening up the dark-squared bishop and allowing black some chances for activity. A much stronger move for white to play is e takes d5. White is now threatening to win a pawn with bishop e1, so black plays bishop d6. Black's bishop protects both the c5 and e5 pawns and is ready to move to c7 to guard the a5 pawn if needed. After trading queens, white's next step is to bring the king into the game and focus on a target. Which pawn can white's king add pressure against? That's right, the e5 pawn. After king f3, king f7, and king e4, white has centralized the king and is beginning to add pressure to the e5 pawn. After king f6, black is trying to hold the position together. In order to win a game of chess, you often need at least 2 weaknesses. White has pressure on e5 with the king. Can you find a plan that maneuvers the bishop to help attack e5 and attack a second weakness? If you realize that moving the bishop to c3 would attack both e5 and a5 at the same time, great job. After bishop e1, forcing bishop c7, with bishop c3, white now is attacking 2 weaknesses, the a5 and e5 pawns, at the same time. Notice black's bishop is stuck on c7 as it has to protect pawns on 2 diagonals. Black's king also can't move because white would simply win one of the weak pawns. Black can only wait by playing a move such as h6. White has played very well, but how do you win the game? If white can force the king or bishop to move, black will lose the e5 pawn. How can white make this happen? We need to make waiting moves as well, trying to run black out of moves. After h3, if black plays g5, white will run black out of moves with g4. After h5, white freezes black's kingside pawns with h4. Black is now out of waiting moves. If the bishop or king moves, one of black's pawns will fall. If black tries g5, white can win with h takes g5, forcing black's king to move and capture the e5 pawn. Can you find an even stronger move that takes advantage of black's overworked king? If you found the powerful bishop takes e5 check, great job! Black's overworked king cannot protect both the e5 and g5 squares, so after bishop takes e5, h takes g5 check, king takes g5, and king takes e5, white's passed d-pawn will win the game. Are you ready to put your plan into action? Prove it in the challenges. It has been said that chess is 99% tactics. Tactics are an essential part of the game, as finding or missing a tactic often is the difference between winning or losing a chess game below master level. However, tactics do not come out of thin air. You usually need to build a strong position by placing your pieces on good squares and having your pieces work together. Positional advantages include having a well-protected king, more control of the center, enjoying greater space and mobility for your pieces, not having badly placed pieces or pieces that do not have a purpose, and having a healthy pawn structure. Let's take a look at some positions and learn how to improve our positional play. In this fairly closed position, there doesn't appear to be a lot of action or chance for tactics. With black to move, it isn't easy to figure out what black should play. When you are in a position where you don't know what to do, one good positional idea is to find your worst placed piece and improve it. In this position, which black piece appears to be doing very little? Black's knights protect each other and help control the center, and black's bishop on d6 is well centralized, controlling many key dark squares. What about black's bishop on e8? What is it doing? It's preventing black's rooks from being connected, and it isn't really doing anything. How can black improve this piece and give it a purpose? That's right, bishop to h5. This is a strong positional idea. Black's bishop that was doing less than nothing on e8 is now pinning white's f3 knight to the queen, and it also connects black's rooks. Now that the bishop isn't sitting on e8, a black rook could use that square to enjoy the semi-open e-file. After queen to d3, white centralizes the queen, improving its position and unpinning the knight on f3. Notice the queen also attacks black's pawn on f5. Can you see how black can improve a piece and block white's threat of capturing the f5 pawn? If you found knight to e4, great job! Black invades white's territory, placing the knight directly in the center, and also blocks white's queen from threatening the f5 pawn. Notice the f6 square is now available for other pieces to use, and black enjoys a space advantage. One step at a time, black is building a better position. Things are not looking great for black in this position. White has a powerful pawn chain from b2 to e5. White's space advantage is keeping black's pieces passive, and it's hard to find an active plan for black. Notice how white's minor pieces are all pointing at black's kingside. The bishop on d3 is an excellent piece, enjoying an open diagonal on b1 to h7, placing serious pressure on black's kingside. Compare that bishop to black's light-squared bishop. It has very little space and is blocked by its own pawn on d5. Since black's light-squared bishop is clearly worse than white's bishop, black plays bishop to a6, removing one of white's best minor pieces for one of black's less active pieces. When you have less space and your pieces are not as good as your opponent's, trading pieces can often improve your position. After bishop takes a6 and knight takes a6, black's knight on a6 isn't on a great square, but black has removed a lot of pressure from the kingside since there is no longer a light-squared bishop attacking the h7 square. Now that black has less to worry about on the kingside, black can take time to improve the knight's position on a6. For example, if white attacks the knight with queen e2, where should the knight move? It could move to c7, but it doesn't look very active on that square. Would the knight rather be on c6, where it could put more pressure on white's center? Absolutely. But how can the knight get there? That's right, knight a to b8. Even though retreating the knight to b8 seems wrong, it is a strong plan because once the knight moves to c6, it will be very active. Don't worry about making moves that look bad if the move supports a strong positional plan. Let's take a look at one more position together. In this position, white enjoys a comfortable game. Notice that black has doubled pawns on the c-file, and white's light-squared bishop is pointing at the weak c6 pawn. White only has to gain control of the center and complete development to have a good position. One good plan for white is to play d3, opening up the dark squared bishop and preparing the plan c3, d4, taking over the center. You might wonder why waste time with d3 if the plan is to play d4. Why not save a move and play c3, preparing d4? After c3, white is threatening d4, attacking black's bishop and taking over the center. Every time you push a pawn, you gain control of new squares, but you also lose control of other squares. Since pawns can never move backwards, make sure there are no problems with the space you leave behind. In this case, notice the pawn on c2 protected d3 and b3. And after the pawn moved to c3, there is a big hole on d3. Can you see how black can take advantage of this weak square and prevent d4? Black can play the powerful queen to d3. Taking advantage of the weakness created on d3, preventing d4, and paralyzing white's position. Notice how white's dark squared bishop is particularly bad. Black plans on completing development with bishop d7 and rook a to e8, when all of black's pieces are working together. White's passive, scattered pieces will be no match. Now that you've learned the importance of positional play, it's time to test your skills. At the beginning of the game, all of the pieces start on the same squares, but it's your job to make your pieces good and avoid having bad pieces. A good piece is active and has a purpose, where it controls important squares and has plenty of space available to move. Good pieces often control enemy squares. The more of those squares, the better. A bad piece is the opposite. It's passive, has very little mobility, and controls little to no opponent squares. Let's take a look at some examples of good versus bad pieces. In this position, White has a good rook on d1, controlling the only open file on the board. Black's rook, on the other hand, is passive on e8, only controlling space on Black's side of the board without any clear targets. White makes the good rook even better by playing rook to d7, taking over the 7th rank and threatening to win the c7 pawn. Black's rook becomes extremely passive after rook to c8. This is a classic case of good piece versus bad piece. White has pressure on c7, which ties down Black's rook to passive defense. Notice White's rook also has pressure on g7, so Black's king cannot help the rook on the queenside without losing the kingside pawns. Black is helpless, and White has the very simple plan of bringing the king to b7, capturing the a7 pawn, and then promoting the a6 pawn into a queen. Let's take a look at another position together. In this position, Black decides to attack the bishop on c4 with knight to a5. Although this threatens to capture White's bishop and double White's pawns on the c-file, White can simply play bishop to a2, retreating the bishop to safety where it is still a good piece. The bishop controls squares on the a2 to g8 diagonal, and the bishop can also move to the b1 to h7 diagonal, where it will be pointing directly at Black's king once the d3 pawn moves out of the way. Notice after Black's knight left c6, where it was a good piece controlling key central squares, it is now on the edge of the board and is a bad piece. The knight isn't doing anything useful and controls half the amount of squares it did a move ago. Instead of turning the knight into a bad piece for a one-move attack, what should Black have done instead? Notice all of White's minor pieces are developed, controlling important central squares, and are working together. Black's bishop on c8, however, is undeveloped and doing nothing. How can Black activate the bishop and turn it into a good piece? A strong move for Black is b5. Gaining a tempo by attacking the white bishop, grabbing queenside space, and opening the b7 square for Black's light-squared bishop. After bishop to a2 and bishop to b7, Black's bishop enters the long diagonal h1 to a8, where it will be a powerful piece, and it also connects Black's rooks. Black's position is much better now that the light-squared bishop has been made a good piece. Let's take a look at one more position together. In this position, can you tell which pieces are good and which pieces are bad for both sides? Both sides have good light-squared bishops. Black's bishop on d7 controls two open diagonals, a4 to e8 and h3 to c8. White's light-squared bishop is also actively placed, and it targets the weak b7 pawn. White's dark-squared bishop, on the other hand, protects two pawns, but it is also passive as it is blocked by those pawns. Notice Black's knight is a very bad piece as it is stuck on the back rank and only has two available squares to move, c6 and e6. With White to move, can you see how White can completely paralyze Black's knight on d8 and make the dark-squared bishop a good piece? That's right, with d5. Although White's light-squared bishop is now blocked by the d5 pawn for the moment, White opens up the dark-squared bishop, threatening to win the knight with bishop to f6. The only way to not lose the knight is by moving the pawn on f7 to give the knight an escape square. After f5, White wins the pawn with g takes f6. White now has two passed pawns on f6 and d5 and is ready to activate White's light-squared bishop with d6. White's active and powerful bishops, as well as the extra material, should be enough to win the game. Now that you've learned the importance of making your pieces good and taking advantage of bad pieces, it's time to test your skills. It is a great feeling to win brilliant attacking games where everything comes together, from the first to the last move. Unfortunately, this rarely happens in chess, and sometimes you find yourself in a difficult or bad position. Being able to fight back from such positions is one of the most important skills to learn. Let's take a look at this position. After White plays the aggressive queen to g4, threatening Black's unprotected g-pawn, Black has to make a difficult decision. There isn't a great way to defend the g7 pawn. Black can either push the pawn to g6 or play the move king to f8. When you are in a difficult position, you should try and not make your position worse. Moving the king to f8 and losing the right to castle seems like a bad choice, but let's consider Black's other option, g6. Every time a pawn is moved, weaknesses are made. Notice that once the pawn moved from g7, it no longer protects f6 and h6. This means the dark squares have been weakened, and since Black does not have a dark squared bishop to protect these squares, this could be a problem later in the game. Notice white has a pawn on h4 and can now use the g6 pawn as a hook to open up the position after h5. White is threatening to open up the h-file with h takes g6, which would open up white's rook on h1. By playing g6, black has created dark square weaknesses and allowed white to open up the position with h5. Let's return to the position after white played queen to g4. Although moving the king looks bad, it turns out to be black's strongest move. After king to f8, black protects the g-pawn and does not make any pawn weaknesses. Black has lost the right to castle, but is this a big problem? In a position with a lot of open lines for attack, this would be a terrible decision. But is this position open? No, it's actually very closed. Notice that the center is locked. And white's king may also prefer to stay in the center where there is less danger at the moment. Black will plan on playing knight g to e7, eyeing the f5 square with a very solid position. Notice that white has an unprotected pawn on c2 that may be attacked with a later queen to a4. That being said, white still has an advantage due to having more space on the king side, and black's rook on h8 may have difficulties getting into the game. By defending with the king, black did not create any weak squares or allow a clear line of attack, so black has made a good defensive decision. In this position, white is cramped for space. The pawn on d4 is preventing both white's dark-squared bishop and knight on c2 from being active. Black's pieces are much more active and enjoy the extra space to move freely around the board. White's biggest problem is less space and passive pieces. How can white fight back in this position? Since the d4 pawn is the main cause of white's problems, white can attack its key defender, the c5 pawn, with the powerful move b4. White adds pressure to black's central pawn chain. If black captures the b4 pawn with c takes b4, black's center is destroyed after knight f takes d4, regaining the pawn and opening up the powerful light-squared bishop on the long diagonal. Black can play b6, protecting the c5 pawn, but it gives up protection of the knight and weakens the light squares. Black is in trouble after b5. And after knight a5, white opens up the light-squared bishop with the move knight g5. White's knight and rook attack black's bishop on e6, and white's light-squared bishop is threatening black's rook on a8. Black's best option is to continue development with queen to d7, connecting black's rooks and preparing to offer a trade of bishops with bishop to h3, wanting to remove white's powerful light-squared bishop. Now that white has added pressure to the c5 square, white's bishop on b2 joins the fight with bishop to a3. White has activated the passive bishop on b2 and threatens to win a pawn on c5 on the next turn. Black should play c takes b4. And after knight takes b4, white's dark-squared bishop and knight have been activated, and white now has a semi-open b-file to use for a rook to join in putting black's queenside under pressure. White's active strategy of fighting against black's space advantage in the center and activating white's passive pieces has greatly improved white's position. Let's take a look at one more example together. In this position, black has some problems to solve. Black controls less space, has a white rook pointing directly at black's king, and has to figure out how to develop the dark-squared bishop. King safety is a serious issue, as castling queenside would lose a pawn to bishop takes f7. What is black to do? One natural idea for black is to play e6, opening up lines for the dark-squared bishop and also preventing white's light-squared bishop from capturing f7. Unfortunately for black, white's active pieces blast open black's defenses, starting with the crushing sacrifice, bishop takes e6. After f takes e6 and knight takes e6, for the moment, white has sacrificed a bishop for for 2 pawns, but notice that the white knight is attacking black's queen. Now that the e-pawn has been removed, the only piece blocking black's king from white's rook is the white knight on e6. This means there will be a discovered check after black moves the queen. After queen to b6, can you find white's powerful discovered check in this position? If you found knight to c7 check, great job! White's knight leaves the e-file, discovering the rook's check on the black king, and also threatens to capture the rook at the same time. Black's king will be stuck in the center of the board, so white will regain the sacrificed material by capturing black's rook and have great attacking chances against black's weak king. Since the natural move e6 doesn't work, what should black do? Castling queenside would make black's king safe and allow black to complete development, but didn't we say the f7 pawn was hanging if black castled queenside? How can you defend the f7 pawn before castling queenside? Grandmaster David Bronstein, playing the black pieces, made the surprising move bishop to g8. Black's active bishop on h7 is buried on g8, but this solves black's problems with the f7 pawn. Once the f7 pawn was protected, Bronstein was able to castle queenside. Black solved the biggest problem in the position, king safety, by playing the ugly-looking bishop g8 move. When you play difficult or bad positions, you have to be creative and decide if a move works or not. No matter how ugly it may look, play the move if it works. Now it's time to see if you can manage difficult positions. Chess is a game of many opportunities. There is a big difference between a losing position and actually losing the game. A losing position is a position with best play from your opponent. You will lose the game. When you are in a losing position, your job is to create as many problems for your opponent as possible. The best way to do that is to keep a positive attitude and not give up. Let's look at some examples of how to defend losing positions. In this position, Black is up a bishop and is doing well. Black's best move is to gain more material and offer a trade of rooks with rook takes a2. When you have a material advantage, it's usually a good idea to offer trades, especially if you can remove your opponent's greatest source of counterplay, the queen. For this reason, Black plays queen to f6, skewering the white queen to the unprotected rook on a1. In general, the losing side wants to keep things complicated and to avoid trades, especially the most powerful piece, the queen. White finds a clever idea with queen takes d6. White captures a pawn and offers the rook on a1. In a winning position, you should always look for your opponent's counterplay, especially checks. Black doesn't think that White has any real threats and quickly captures White's rook with queen takes a1. What idea did Black overlook? Now that the queen no longer protects d8, White plays queen to d8 check, forcing king to h7. And White salvages a draw from a losing position with queen h4 check. After king g8, White will force a draw after queen d8 check. This is known as a perpetual check. Black cannot escape White's checks, and the game is a draw. Always remember to look for perpetual check opportunities when you are in a difficult or losing position. Let's take a look at another example. In this position, White is up a rook and a pawn and is offering a trade of queens. If the queens are traded, Black has no counterplay and will surely lose. Instead of accepting a losing position, Black plays the resourceful queen to g7. Black refuses to trade queens, keeping the position complicated. After queen to g7, Black has even set up a trap. Do you see it? Remember, the winning side should always look out for chances for counterplay, especially all checks and captures the opponent can make. But when you have a winning advantage, it is easy to get happy and overlook your opponent's ideas. In this position, White should have noticed that Black's queen now lines up on the same file as White's king. Always a dangerous situation. With that in mind, White just needs to eliminate any tactics by playing king to h1, removing any possible tricks in the position. Instead, White lunges forward with h4, thinking that Black's checks were useless, missing the fact that after knight f3 check, White's bishop is pinned, so Black forks the king and the queen. It is easy to get discouraged when you throw away a winning position, but it is important to focus on what you can do now and not worry about the past. After king to f1 and knight takes e1, even though things look difficult for White, after rook takes e1, White should be able to still draw this position. Notice that White's king protects the bishop and pawn on f2, so the only targets Black has is the unprotected b4 and h4 pawns. After queen to d4, if White doesn't get discouraged and looks for the best moves, White can hold the position with rook to e4, attacking Black's queen and protecting both the b4 and h4 pawns. After queen to d1 check, and rook e1, and queen to b3, Black cannot make progress after rook e4. All of White's pieces protect each other. Even though White threw away a winning position, White can still avoid losing by playing careful defense. Let's take a look at one more example together. In this position, White is up two connected passed pawns on the queen side. This should be enough to win the game with careful play. Things don't look good for Black, but as the defender, remember to play to your strengths. Even though Black is in big trouble on the queen side, do you notice that black has more space on the king side? Black creates a problem for white to solve after queen to h4. Black's queen joins the light-squared bishop in adding pressure to the h3 square. White has a winning position, but once again, it is important to consider your opponent's ideas. White should play bishop to f1, protecting white's kingside and eliminating black's chances of a counterattack. Once black's attacking chances are prevented, white's queenside pawns will win the game. Instead of finding the defensive move that should win the game, white is too excited and rushes forward with b7. Pushing the pawn forward, ready to promote the pawn on the next turn, completely overlooking black's powerful bishop sacrifice, bishop takes h3. White's winning position is now completely losing. Black's threat of bishop takes g2, discovering the queen's check, is too powerful. If white accepts the bishop with g takes h3, the game will finish quickly after queen takes h3 check, and after king g1, queen h2 check, king f1, g2 check, king f2, g1 equals queen, checkmate. If white tries to give the king an escape square on e2 with bishop to d3, black's kingside pressure will be too much to handle after bishop takes g2 check, king takes g2, and queen h2 check. After king to f1, it is now black's turn to be careful. One of the most dangerous moments in a chess game is when you are on the verge of winning. Make sure to double-check your opponent's counterplay. If black thinks the position is a simple checkmate after queen to f2 check, black is in for a big surprise after queen takes f2. And once again, white now has a winning position. Black's path to victory begins after g2 check. To avoid checkmate, white must play king to e2. Black now promotes to a second queen with the discovered check g1 equals queen, check. After king to d1, black's simplest option is to play queen takes a7. Black is now completely winning, but as we should now know, a game of chess is not over until it's over. Can you save a losing position? Let's see. World champion Emanuel Lasker famously stated, "The hardest game to win is the one game." We can all relate to letting a great game slip out of our hands, and it even happens to the greatest chess players from time to time. In this position, Lasker himself proves how hard it can be to win a one game. White is down an incredible amount of material, but notice that Lasker's pawn on h7 is ready to promote into a queen on the next move. There doesn't seem to be any way Black can stop the promotion when the new queen gives all the winning chances to White. When you are in a winning position, it is easy to relax, get happy, and think that any move will win. This is exactly what you need to avoid to win the one game. You need to stay alert and look out for tactical chances until the very end of the game. In this position, Lasker has several ways to escape the rook checks. One idea is to play king f1. In an endgame, you usually don't want to cut your king off from the rest of the action, but here White is keeping the position as simple as possible to eliminate any tactical chances for the opponent. Black has only one sensible check with rook c1 check. And after king e2, rook c2 check, White can put an end to the rook checks with king d3. Sacrificing one pawn, but after rook takes g2 and h8 equals queen, White's queen now takes over the game, attacking Black's king, and will start collecting pawns. Black may have chances to draw with careful play, but now White is the only side playing for a win. Let's see what Lasker decided to play in the game. Lasker thought he could end Black's counterplay and win quickly after king g3, rook c3 check. Lasker can still repeat the position with king f2 and then try another course, but Lasker played king g4. Because after rook c4 check and king g5, White's king appears safe from any tactics, but it's important to remember that as you march your king closer to your opponent's forces, you always have to stay alert for tactical chances against your king. Lasker may have expected Black to resign, but believe it or not, it will soon be Lasker's turn to resign. Can you find Black's incredible move that wins the game? If you found rook h4, fantastic job. Black threatens to capture the h7 pawn, White's only hope to win the game, and after king takes h4, White's king is forced to the unfortunate h4 square, allowing Black to open up the g7 square for the king with g5 check. White's king is forced to deal with the check when after king takes g5, Black's king catches White's dangerous passed pawn with king g7. After defending against White's threat of promotion, Black's connected passed pawns on the queenside will win the game for Black. This was a pretty complicated example, but it shows us how many chances there are in a chess game and how easy it is to throw away a great position. Let's take a look at some more examples and learn how to win the one game. In this position, the material imbalance is between White's 2 rooks and 3 extra pawns versus Black's 3 minor pieces, which is definitely better for White. Notice Black's king is only protected by pieces, not pawns, so Black's king safety is also not great. With White to move, how do we win the one game? One very tempting move is queen h6, threatening checkmate on the next turn. If Black tries to block the g-file with a bishop or a knight on g6, White can trade one of the rooks for 2 minor pieces, simplifying the position to White's favor. If Black tries to protect the bishop with queen f8, White can simply win the knight with rook takes e5, taking advantage of the pinned bishop on g7. Everything looks great after queen h6, but notice we have only been looking at Black's defensive moves. Always remember to look for your opponent's active, forcing moves, as overlooking these moves can cause serious problems. Black has the very interesting option of knight f3 check. The knight checks White's king and discovers the Black queen's attack on the rook on g3. Since capturing with the rook would unpin Black's bishop and allow Black to win White's queen, White should play g takes f3. Black sacrificed the knight in order to play the surprising move queen takes g3 check, capturing the rook with check and unpinning the bishop on g7. White captures the queen with h takes g3. Capturing with the h-pawn keeps the king sheltered against the 2 bishops. After bishop takes h6 and rook takes e7, White's position is still winning, but Black's 2 bishops may cause problems for White, so Black still has some hope. In winning positions, we want to simplify our task as much as possible. Let's see if we can find an easier way to win this game. We mentioned the importance of looking for forcing moves your opponent can play, but don't forget to look at your own forcing moves as well. Can you find a forcing move for white that can simplify the position? In the game, white played rook takes g7 check. And after king takes g7, notice black's king is lined up on the same diagonal as the knight on e5. After queen d4, white is threatening queen takes e5, entering a simplified ending when white's rook and extra pawns should have no problems against black's bishop. If black tries to defend the knight with king f6, white can add more pressure to the pinned knight with f4. White is ready to play queen takes e5, trading queens, or if black moves the queen away first, black's exposed king will not survive long. White avoided unnecessary complications and soon won the game by trading down into a rook and several extra pawns versus bishop endgame. Let's take a look at one more example together. In this position, we join a tournament game that I was playing with the black pieces. Black is on the attack, and it looks like white's king is in serious trouble. If rook h1 check, white is forced to capture the pawn on g2, but it wasn't clear to me what to do next. I thought about bishop f3 to protect the g2 pawn first, but then I am simply dropping a bishop to the knight. Unfortunately, I didn't ask myself the follow-up question. What if I removed the knight first? Can you find the winning move that I missed? If you found the queen sacrifice queen takes e5, great job! By removing the knight that was protecting the f3 square, black not only is up a piece for the moment, but has an overwhelming attack. If white captures the queen with rook takes e5, after bishop f3, white's king is trapped, and rook h1 checkmate is unstoppable. I completely missed the winning queen sacrifice and simply played rook d to g8, preparing to play bishop f3 to threaten rook h1 checkmate. As expected, white played f3, attacking my bishop and opening up an escape square for the king on f2. I already missed one winning move, and now my opponent is starting to fight back. Here it is all too easy to start reacting to your opponent's play, and I almost retreated my bishop to f5. One of the keys to winning the one game is staying alert and keeping your pieces as active as possible. Why can't black capture the pawn on f3? Yes, the knight protects the square, but what happens then? After bishop takes f3, I saw through my opponent's aggression and realized there is nothing to fear. My opponent did not capture the bishop, but white's unprotected king did not survive long. If white played knight takes f3, let's practice winning the one game. After black plays rook h1 check and king f2, do you see a clear win? Before beginning to calculate these complications, stay on the surface. Is there a simpler move that prevents the white king from escaping to f2? That's right. Black can play queen g3. Now rook h1 checkmate is unstoppable. Now that you've learned the skills necessary to bring home the victory, can you win the one game? Let's see. Is chess a science, sport, or an art? Or is it something completely different? There are many different answers depending on who you ask. The second world chess champion, Emanuel Lasker, called chess the human struggle. Chess is a clash of ideas between two players. Not only do you have to struggle against your opponent, you also have to face yourself. Chess is a very logical game, but it is also psychological, as we must learn how to deal with the roller coaster of emotions we can experience during a chess game. The joy of finding a tactical combination, the disappointment of throwing away a completely winning position, and the thrill of attacking the opponent's king are just a few of these emotions. Today we're going to look at one of my own games and explore the inner game of chess psychology. In this game, I have the white pieces. I am 17 years old with a rating of 1791. My opponent was rated 2394 and was the top competitor in this National Scholastic Championship. Playing a higher rated opponent can be very intimidating. I remember feeling nervous before the game started. How can I possibly compete against such a strong player, I wondered. I did my best to focus on the game and take it one move at a time. Easier said than done. My 600-point higher-rated opponent, playing the black pieces, is on the move. He played knight to b6, gaining a tempo against my bishop. I have an isolated queen pawn, so if he can control the square in front of the pawn, in this case d5, and begin to trade pieces, my isolated queen pawn will become more of a weakness. After bishop d3, and knight f-d5, black's knight blockades my isolated pawn, preventing it from advancing, and also opening up an attack against my dark-squared bishop. Since my bishop doesn't have a great square to retreat, I traded bishops with bishop takes e7 and queen takes e7. Black has traded a pair of minor pieces, one step closer to his goal of entering an endgame where I am stuck with a weak, isolated pawn. One strength of the isolated pawn in the middle game is since it does not have a pawn able to protect it on the files next to it, in this case the c and the e files. These files can be used by the rooks and queen. After rook e1, my rook enjoys the semi-open e file and x-rays black's queen. Now black can play a normal move such as bishop d7, preparing to anchor a knight on d5 with bishop c6. The game may continue slowly, where white will have some chances of building an attack on the king side, but black will have a solid game. One of the biggest challenges to remember when playing a much higher rated opponent is that the higher rated opponent often feels great pressure to defeat you. Instead of focusing on your own emotions, fearing the rating of your opponent, remember that they also have to deal with their own psychological pressure. My opponent must have felt this pressure and decided to take a serious risk by playing f5. When I first saw this move, I was completely shocked. My opponent is 600 points higher rated than me, so he must know what he's doing, right? I started to imagine all of his kingside pawns rushing forward with g5 and h5. I felt like I was going to be pushed right off the board. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and decided to look at the position, not my opponent's rating. Although this move looks aggressive, it doesn't threaten anything yet. No matter how strong a move may look, you always have to look for its weaknesses. By playing f5, black's e6 pawn is now backward as it can only be protected by pieces and will be a long-term target. Notice by moving the pawn off f7, the a2 to g8 diagonal has been weakened, and black's king is on that diagonal. After calming my emotions and analyzing the position, I realized this move was a serious weakness, and I played queen b3. My queen is now on the same diagonal as my opponent's king, and more pressure is being added to the d5 knight. If my opponent played a normal-looking move, such as developing a piece with bishop d7, can you see the real threat I created by playing queen b3? White has a powerful combination starting with knight takes d5. Since the e-pawn is pinned to black's queen, after knight takes d5, I was ready to play queen takes d5, winning a piece, since after e takes d5 and rook takes e7, white is up a full piece and is already invading black's territory. Instead of allowing this tactic, my opponent wisely moved his queen off of the dangerous e-file with queen f6. After knight takes d5, black decided not to recapture with the e-pawn, which would create an isolated pawn, and open up the e-file for white's rook. Instead, black played knight takes d5. I increased the pressure against black's knight with bishop c4. And after black added another defender to the knight with rook d8, how can white add more pressure against the knight on d5? If you found rook e5, great job. White's rook adds more pressure to black's knight and also prepares to complete development with rook a to e1. Black moved the knight to safety with knight c7, and after rook a to e1, all of white's pieces are already developed and black is feeling the pressure against the backward e6 pawn. This is why a move like f5 should only be played after very careful thought. Pawns cannot move backwards, and black is stuck defending the weak e6 pawn. Black played rook e8, adding more protection to the weak e6 pawn. My opponent's risky strategy has backfired, and he is in serious trouble. As my position continued to get better and better, I became more and more nervous and fearful. I must be missing something, I thought. Once again, I started to fear my opponent. So I closed my eyes, paused, and forced myself to focus on the position, not my opponent's rating. Since the e6 pawn is pinned, I was very tempted to play d5, which turns out to be a very powerful move. But when you have a safe, very strong position, it's a good idea to keep the position simple and clear so your opponent doesn't have a chance to escape in the complications. Black's only active move is b5, trying to break out of his bind. Rather than rushing forward and allowing complications, I took a deep breath, realized there was no hurry, and I prevented my opponent's only chance for counterplay by playing a4. Now that b5 is under control, I was ready to blast open the position with d5. My opponent, in desperation, tried to complicate things by playing b5 anyway. Without having a pawn on a4, my only option to capture the pawn would be with bishop takes b5, when rook b8 would pin my bishop to the queen. I wanted to avoid this, so I played a takes b5. My opponent pinned the pawn to my queen with rook b8, but his scattered army is no match for my fully developed pieces working together. I pushed forward with d5. Black does not want to capture the pawn and lose material on the e-file, so he played bishop b7. Finally completing development and connecting his rooks, but it is too little too late. After d6, my isolated pawn is now a pass pawn, marching up the board and pushing black's pieces around. After knight d5, the pass pawn advances again with d7, attacking black's rook. If black's rook leaves the e-file, white will crash through with rook takes e6, so black played rook e7. Imagine yourself in my situation. I have outplayed the top player in this national tournament, and I know that I am close to winning the game. This is the most dangerous moment in a chess game, because when you realize you are winning, it is easy to relax and become overconfident. I had to once again close my eyes and allow my emotions to run its course. After taking a deep breath, I reminded myself to focus on the position itself and use the same thought process I used to enter a winning position in order to actually win the game. I calculated a combination where I would sacrifice my queen, knowing that the pass pawn on d7, combined with my powerful rooks and knight, would overwhelm my opponent's position. I started the combination with bishop takes d5. After bishop takes d5, I quickly double-checked my analysis, realized it worked, and with a trembling hand I played the queen sacrifice, queen takes d5. By sacrificing my queen, I open up the e-file for my powerful rooks. After e takes d5 and rook takes e7, my threat is rook e8 check, attacking black's rook and promoting the passed pawn. If my opponent blocked the promotion square with rook d8, I would win the game by playing rook e8 check, king f7, and after knight e5 check, black is forced to give up his queen when white has an overwhelming advantage. My opponent decided to play queen d6, and after rook e8 check, king f7. Can you find a combination that forces black to give up his queen? If you decided to bring your last piece into the attack by playing knight g5 check, great job. Black's king is forced to the same rank as the queen after king f6, White forks the black king and queen with rook 1 to e6 check, and after queen takes e6, knight takes e6. White is now completely winning. Although I had an overwhelming position, I still was afraid that my opponent's rook could somehow deliver a back-rank checkmate. Once again, I focused on the position instead of my emotions and realized I was going to promote my pawn into a queen and easily win the game. My opponent resigned the game, which completed my biggest tournament upset in my chess career. Some important things to remember from this game include that you too can play chess, and all chess players make mistakes. Do not allow fear to overwhelm you. Your opponent also has their own struggles. Remember to take a deep breath and return your focus to the position. Are you ready to overcome your emotions and find good moves? Let's put you to the test.